I'm Celia Rabinovitch. I was born in Morden and grew up there for the first part of my life, then was raised in Winnipeg. My parents were Milton and Sheila Rabinovitch. They're both gone now. Milton was also born in Morden in 1909, and he came from a family of 9 children. They owned Rabinovitch Brothers store on Stephen Street, which was just unfortunately torn down. It was a historic site, but the side of the building had gone. It became the florist shop, but it was right next to Burgess's bakery, which I don't know what it is now, and across from the drugstore. My grandfather came to Morden in 1890. He escaped from Russia and came with another fellow named Corman. And initially they were going to go to New York, but they were met by an agent of the Baron de Hirsch, who was bringing Jewish people over to Canada and Australia and today's Israel. And they arrived in Canada and were given land out west. And he chose Morden. He had been a grain dealer in Russia, among other things, a multi-talented man. And in 1893, he opened his establishment on Railway Avenue. Later in 1929, my father took over the store, which moved to Stephen Street, and it became Rabinovitch Brothers store, which was a dry goods store and sold clothing to farm workers and supplies to people sewing. It was a great meeting place in the town. Apparently, people congregated there in the evenings, especially Saturday night when they stayed open for the farmers. And my grandfather financed a lot of the farmers in the Depression. In 1910, when his store burnt down, what happened was that everyone in the town chipped in to help rebuild it, because Morden, as you know, is a very warm and supportive environment and very, I might say, ecumenical, egalitarian. So even when I was born, I felt no class or religion differences. It was a most kind of embracing, compassionate environment full of beautiful flowers and trees and people very proud of their homes. So what happened in 1910 was my grandfather kept a record of everyone who had helped him, and he paid them all back. And then later, when he was doing well during the Depression, he helped finance the farmers for the things they needed. Then my father became part of he was head of the Morden Chamber of Commerce, and he helped distribute pesticide for the locust invasions, which happened in the 30s. And he helped with the planting of carragana bushes to keep your soil at home. For my research for this exhibition, I looked into the Morden newspapers and the town council proceedings. So that's how I found out about that. My father's cousin was Nick Yudell. Nick Yudell was the son of a couple from Russia, actually the Ukraine, but then under Imperial Russia. And his father had been a cornet player in the Russian army. And he escaped from Russia in 1903. He came to New York and met his fiancée, who he knew before, Nettie Cluner, there. They married, and then they came to Winnipeg in 1905. They had 3 children. Nick was the youngest of 3 children. So the 2 older children were already in elementary school when Nick was born in 1916. His mother died of blood poisoning in 1918. And so the father took care of him for 2 years, but he was running the Star Trading Company on Winnipeg's Dufferin Avenue in the North End, and he couldn't manage to take care of a toddler, have 2 school-age children, and run a store. So he brought him out to live with his maternal aunt, my grandmother Sonia, and my grandfather Doc Rabinovitch, as he was known, in Morden with their large family of 7 children. He became the youngest in the family. He was the baby of the family, and everyone adored him. He was a very beautiful child. And I think they all took him under their wing and just, he was a brother to my father. Nick actually had two families because he would go up and back to Winnipeg and back to Morden with truckers or family members who are driving in and out. And don't forget, there was a railway that went to Morden. There were a lot of north-south railways then. So he had two families, embraced by both. And at the age of 12, one of the family members gave him a camera, most likely a Brownie camera. And so in 1928, he started taking photographs of his cousins in Morden in different poses, of things that happened in the environment. And he just continued. He went to St. John's Tech High School in Winnipeg, and he photographed all of his classmates in unusual poses. Many of them were taken from film noir ideas with strong light and shade. You know, this was still pre-code Hollywood, and there were lots of things in the films that maybe people didn't like later, so that was canceled later. So he became very passionate about photography. He had to study it. And in 1933, he came back to Morden. And because there was no work, he worked in the store with my father, Milton. I know this because I have the records from the store, from the old account register, which was a McCoskey account register right out of Deadwood, big wood oak register. And there was a book with all the receipts from the store, and I can tell the difference between Nick's handwriting and my father's handwriting. So we actually know what people were buying then, like thread or work pants or work boots or nice clothes from Tip Top Tailors. I mean, they carried the full range of dry goods. So during that time, he educated himself on photography. He tried different methods like double exposures. He tried to have sort of play scenarios. He photographed in the nurses' residence, Marian Vrooman in particular, who was head of the nurses' residence. And he did some parties, costume parties that they had there. They did dress up. He had Vic Burgess, who was the son of the baker, Pop Burgess. He had him pose as a gangster on the outskirts of Morden, and he himself posed with a rifle. Some of those might be seen as politically incorrect today, but don't forget, it was the 30s. Gangsters were considered kind of cool, and they were play acting these things. So Nick captured different themes in his photographs. And when I first started looking at the negatives, which was in 2007, and I was scanning them because digital technologies allowed for that, I saw that he had themes of play, of place, of portraits and self-portraits. He did a whole series of self-portraits, which challenged today's selfie because they're very introspective. He's not trying to glamorize himself, but he's using himself as a model. And you get the sense of a very quiet, introspective personality who was very sensitive and very tall, actually. He came from a tall family, so he's probably over 6 feet. And they're just really remarkable because of the lighting and the staging. He also traveled to little towns like Carmen, where he photographed friends. And because of the Rabinovitch brothers store, he and my father would do like day trips to small towns to do deliveries. So he really covered all of southern Manitoba for all the small towns and stores there. I've got photographs from Lac de Bonnet and other areas. During that time, he taught himself composition, lighting, double exposures, and he became fascinated with air flight. So in the mid-30s, his passions for photography and air flight came together. And the first photographs I have that show his interest in air flight are from 1934 of like biplanes on the Red River. He then became head of the Manitoba Model Airplane Association in 1938. Now, model airplanes were a fascination then, and so were pilots. I mean, I've looked into these pilot and aviation magazines, and they're very glamorous with beautiful colors. But he took these model airplanes and he staged them in photographs as if they were real airplanes. And that makes them quite interesting because they are experimental photography, but they show what he was interested in. So what I found really intriguing is his photographs are a kind of visual diary of his themes and interests in his life. So following his interests in air flight, I think he tried to enlist in the RAF in 1939 and he was denied, but he was accepted in 1940. I know this because I received his attestation papers and other RAF documents. And so in 1940, he left for Shiloh for training, later training further in Lethbridge. Then he was sent to Driffield in England for even further training, and then to the Middle East. So he arrived in North Africa in October 1942 during the Second Battle of El Alamein. And at that time, General Montgomery had just been placed there. He was with an international crew, which was led by Ivan Strutt, who was the squadron leader. He was in Squadron 104. Now, an interesting aside for this, I've been doing research on it intermittently since 2007 in an attempt to rebuild what happened to the rest of his life, because the photographs and the oral histories I took tell me what his early life was like. But from 1940 till his death in North Africa in 1943, it was a blank, partly because the RAF didn't allow photography on their bases, and partly because no letters except for letters of condolences were found. I should mention that everything he did was put into brown envelopes that were numbered with the date, time, and then they had the time, date, place, lighting conditions, film, and who is in the photograph. And he put all of these before he left in 1940 in a gray wooden box that he made specifically for his negatives. Now, there were over 300 negatives in there, 2 to an envelope. We know who's in each image, when it was taken, and where it was taken. In other words, we have a complete visual archive of Morden and southwestern Manitoba at that time. This is completely unique. I took this project to Canadian Studies at UC Berkeley. I used to work there as head of continuing ed for fine arts and graphic design. And Nelson Grayburn, who's a well-known anthropologist there, he said to me, Celia, you have to do this. This is a book. This is a complete visual archive. It's equivalent to Peter Pitzelak's photographs of up north. And Shelley Sweeney, who's the archivist, was the head archivist at the University of Manitoba, said to me, we don't know that much what people did in their everyday lives. We know about world events, but we don't know what daily life looked like. So these images give us an opportunity to know and understand a world which has been lost. We might think we understand that world, but it was a completely different world. They had no internet. Their entertainment was entirely homemade. It was dress up or listening to radio or dancing or playing music or reading. And he has photographs of people doing all these things, primarily reading and dress up, sometimes playing music. Now, I should mention that the Rabinovitch family was a very musical family. Unlike me, I'm not a musician, I'm a visual artist. But they had a family band in the 1920s. It was called Wolf Rabinovitch and his Whitecaps. And it used to tour Minnesota, North Dakota, Saskatchewan and Ontario, playing the latest blues and jazz. That was headed by my uncle Wolf, one of my older uncles. So Nick would have seen that, and he would have seen this incredibly adventurous family. My Aunt Ruby Rabinovitch went to New York and joined the Algonquin Club and wrote for the New Yorker under a pseudonym. So all of these stories, both of the family members and then of the townspeople, are interwoven in his photographs. We have a number of photographs of Vic Burgess, as I mentioned, who was the son of the baker. We have photographs of Edith Dickie and Marian Larkey, like some of the people who are nurses, Marian Vrooman, who was head of the nurses' residence. Now, the nurses' residence is gone, but Nick, wanting to be a professional photographer, as it stated in his attestation papers, he said, I want to be a professional photographer when I get out of the forces. They asked him that. And so he had already begun taking portraits for the nurses' residence and of other RAF officers, which were published in the Winnipeg Free Press. So he had great both artistic and professional ambitions as a photographer and also as a pilot. In building this project, I became personally curious because no one knew anything about Nick, not his nieces and nephews, because his family wouldn't talk about the loss. No one in my father's family talked about him except for my father. And my father was a very quiet, sensitive man. And when I was in art school in the 70s, he showed me this gray wooden box, which said, and he said to me, these were Nick's. I couldn't bear to throw them out. Then he added, do you think you could do anything with them? Well, my father died in 2001, but it was kind of a command from the past. And I asked him, well, who was Nick? Well, he was my cousin. He grew up with us. We used to share a bed, and he joined the RAF and he perished in North Africa. Following from that, my father also took movies in the 1930s. They are archival quality movies, and they're really fun. They showed what people did every day, because he also said, move, you need to move, you need to dance, you need to walk across the street, you need to play some music, let's see you roughhosing. And he showed all of that in the movies, and he also filmed at the experimental farm. But my theory, my understanding is that Nick did the still photography and my father did the movies. And so they had these projects going while they were running the store. At times, my father would put his movie camera in the store window and photograph the nurses sliding down snow banks, or Mr. So-and-so going to Archie Macaulay going to mail a letter, right? Things like that. So they're really interesting. My sister, who's a literary person, she said, they're Joycean, they're wonderful. And it is a kind of a myth making about a small town and the personalities in it and how they're interwoven together. Now, Nick's time in the RAF was a blank to me, and no one knew anything about him or what happened to him. I know that my father said that his mother used to send packages of food to North Africa. And so did his niece tell me that she remembered her grandmother packing up salami and other things, to go to the men overseas. So we're talking about what happened in the RAF. I felt I needed to rebuild Nick's story so that I could understand what happened in the latter part of his life. We had the images, we had oral histories, and then I connected with a man named Paul Strutt, who's in England. And he was looking for the grave of his uncle, Ivan Strutt, who was Nick's squadron leader and co-pilot. So he's the one who sent me Nick's attestation papers and all of the RAF documents. Now, I don't know if you know this, but the RAF documents were like an operations handbook, and they were sent to secret coded locations in the Middle East, probably Kabrit and then Tobruk, and then later they were sent to Malta. I was able to find some material through archival documents, through newspapers, mainly Nick's obituary and the notice of RAF officers sent overseas. But in 2011, I heard from Paul Strutt, whose uncle had flown with Nick. And he sent me a number of very fascinating documents, both the RAF documents and Ivan Strutt's diaries, which he wrote in the late 30s. Remember saying to my sister, who does Writers and Company, the CBC program, I said, well, now we know what they were doing, so I can do a parallel life story, how these two boys lived in the 30s. Ivan Strutt was lower aristocracy, and he'd gone to Cambridge, so he had the benefit of university education. And Nick was a rural person who had just gone to high school, but was intensely curious. So when I compared what they were doing, because Ivan had gone to Europe and he'd written about the rise of fascism in Germany, like it kind of in a shocked way. And then I have Nick's photographs of what he was doing in daily life in Morden. So it was really an interesting thing. And I began to construct a parallel lives history as well, which is part of Nick's story. He had a 6-person crew. One member was from Australia. I believe the rest were British. I know the names of about 3 or 4 of them. And I was able to get letters that were written by Geoffrey O'Keeffe's father, who was the Australian gunner's father, as well as from Colonel Strutt, who was the father of Ivan Strutt. And so I began to do a joint journey with Paul Strutt to trace the graves and what happened to these two men. So from the RAF documents, I could rebuild where Nick moved first to Driffield, then to Egypt under Montgomery, and then North Africa, and then flying out of Malta. Nick's earlier life is full of joy and curiosity, and that's the amazing thing about the photographs. There's nothing really that predicts his tragic demise except for the fascination with air flight. When he was sent to North Africa in 1942, he didn't know he wasn't going to come back. He had, however, left this archive in Morden with all of his images. And unfortunately, he perished with the other 5 members of his crew in the North African desert in early 1943. They were trying to bomb Rommel's supply lines into the Mediterranean. So that was how he ended. And their graves were never found. I worked with one of the relatives of the other Air Force people, and that he just became lost to time. I guess we knew about Nick from the movies my father took, and he showed me the box with this question, which persisted in my mind even after my father died. I hadn't been able to do anything with them earlier because I'm not a photographer and I didn't know how to print in the darkroom. But when digital technologies arrived in the 2000s, I thought, well, maybe it's time. Then I got a little bit of research money to start scanning the images. And as I scanned them, I saw this world unfold that was his world and also the world of people in Morden and southwestern Manitoba. And it was astounding. I mean, it was amazing. They told a story with the different themes that he was interested in of play, place, people, and leisure, and experimental photography. I mean, they were just remarkable images. So it just continued from there. I obviously worked on other projects at the same time, but this was one that I want to bring to fruition. I think people are really astounded that there's so much personality in it, both his implied, quiet, attentive personality, where he tried to show people's character, and then the personalities he depicts, because he was mainly interested in portraits and self-portraits. And it's not just finding your relatives or anything like that. It's like seeing them as if they were alive, because they're not posed in a stiff way. They're quite natural. And he obviously knew all of them or got them to be very comfortable. And they're just done that in a way that enhances the individual story and their own personal drama or their personalities. There's been a number of comments from professionals, but what I really want to do is touch the hearts of people from the region and get them to see what an amazing history they have and what a lively place it was. We tend to dismiss the past as if people didn't have interests or they didn't know as much as we did. But these people knew everything. They knew everything about agriculture. They knew how to repair things. They were incredibly curious and they were self-educated. They created new crops that feed the world at the experimental farm. And that's where Nick and my father worked and documented some things. I have some small movies from there. So I think it was a remarkable, very idealistic time. And that idealism is what prompted Nick to enlist, which was a very brave thing to do. Now, I should mention that the people who encouraged me to do this were Ron Laverty and his sister Lenore Laverty. They are very great supporters of Morden and they love the project. And I've had some support from the town since 2011 when I went out there to show the mayor and Maurice Butler and Mel Reimer these images. And so we talked about them and I tried to do oral histories there, which was also very interesting, just to find out anyone who knew Nick. Unfortunately, some people were already gone, but I did get 1 or 2 interviews. I got as much as I could into the exhibition, but there's actually a book behind it. I initially did this as a book and it was designed with a friend of mine in California. So all the photographs are laid out and I have a complete timeline that interweaves world events, developments in photography, with events in Morden and in Nick's life and in the life of his community. So it's a very interesting timeline because it goes from the particular to the universal, from the unknown to the known. So eventually, I hope that will come out. This is the book we designed for the exhibition. It hasn't come out, but it does tell his story, and it has much more detail about his life. So I'm hoping this will come out in the next year or two, and that people will really enjoy some of the images in it. They're really remarkable, as you can see. And it was done, with a great deal of care and attention. There's a party scene from Carmen. Mr. and Mrs. Stobart from Carmen in 34. This is Fritzy Green and Shirley Walsh in the Panama Court Apartments in Winnipeg. I'll show you some from Morden. This is Marian Vrooman with her dog. She was head of the nurses' residence and kept a firm hand on all of the nurses. This is Bert Deans. He was in the forces and he came back and he was the town milkman. But isn't he dramatic? And so now it's at the Manitoba Museum. It's up until August 1st. The title of the exhibition is called The Lost Expressionist, Nick Yudell, a Photographer Discovered. That title barely tells you anything about the images. You have to come and see the show.